Well, we are back and the Trinity is here. I don't mean theologically, of course, I mean myself, Francis and Ed. It's just us today. And we're in a period now where we're entering, we're summer and the lockdown across the world. And so being from the UK, it's starting to ease here. So we're in a sort of tentative place of easing the lockdown. And we are kicking off in this episode with a really interesting subject that we haven't touched into before specifically. So we're going to dedicate this episode, certainly the next one, and we're going to call it the Summer of Miracles, and may even go to a third one. And this has been inspired by, now we always like to get emails from different people, and there's nothing better than getting an email where someone has discovered our podcast and really liked it and avidly follows it. And so we don't have a guest today as such. It's just, as I say, Francis, Ed, myself. And but we will have a virtual guest, because one of the people that emailed into us recently is someone called Christian from Germany. And he has written to us really asking us to look into the subject of miracles, as it pertains to his story quite powerfully. So we will not really talk about anything else. We're going to launch right into this. So Ed, what can you tell us about our virtual guest?
Yes, well, he's called Christian, and I think his words in the email will introduce him better than I can. So
Andrew, you're saying he is a Christian, or?
Well, we'll find out.
We'll find out, okay.
So, Andrew, if you want to read the letter, then Francis will take over in our response.
Certainly, indeed. And it's always nice to get an email or a text or some kind of communication to us from anybody on anything to do with this show, from anything that we've said. And really, it's just really, really welcome. And this one was a very much welcome email. And so we're actually going to focus on this and sort of read it out and see where some of this takes us. So here we go. This is from Christian in Germany. Hey, Francis, Andrew, and Ed. I found your show last summer because Justin-Brierly mentioned it, or mentioned us in his show Unbelievable. Since then, I've never missed an episode. I like your authenticity, but also your vast knowledge of the evangelical world. Sorry, our head is expanding in my room here. And since you mentioned my tweet in the last episode, I'm now a real fanboy of your podcast.
Wow. Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it then. End of the show.
Our job is done.
Yes, that's right. So there we go. We've got one fan. Now we've made our... Yeah, that's right. Okay, Ed. Yeah, what are you going to say?
I wanted you to carry on reading.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought you were going... I thought you sort of came in just to actually say something. Okay. To introduce myself, my name is Christian. I'm currently studying and I come from Germany. I was raised in a fundamental charismatic church, while all the members of my wider family are fundamental Anabaptists, and it's looking very similar to me and my background in a way, and yours, Ed. So I can fully empathize with Ed and Andrew. There you go. Until last year, I would call myself a young earth creationist, but with many doubts since I was 10 or 11. That's quite early to have doubts, actually. I'm currently deconstructing my fundamental belief step by step, or beliefs step by step, in almost every field: evolution, archaeology, biblical inerrancy. Hey, this is me. The skeptic side has a much better arguments. But one topic is still open: miracles. My father is a pastor and leader of a mission organization and talks about many miracles he experienced. Also, my mother and many people of our community witnesses at least some miracles. It's interesting. These are not really supernatural things. I would call them rather very unlikely incidents.
Yes, yeah. Well, before we move on, is that your experience, Andrew, when you were in a kind of charismatic circles, that people did sort of swim in the water of miracles that they were expecting?
Well, I must admit, I was in a fundamentalist charismatic church, very much in the talk and the language of miracles. But I did notice, and I always found myself as a thinking I don't know why. I just thought deeply a lot about stuff. And I seem to sort of, I don't know, other people around me didn't seem to think in the same way. But I kind of noticed that there were so many anecdotal stories told in the third world. And the reason I say this is I kind of got the impression that God was able to work in the third world, but not in the Western world. Yeah. And it was really weird. It's like, how come in a village, somebody can be raised from the dead, grow a hand, do all these kinds of things. And then the church person will stand up and say, got an amazing miracle for you. And it's ultimately hearsay 7 generations down the line, and nothing actually happens in the church, except for the other thing I noticed is it just seemed to be backaches and headaches and feeling better, but nothing grand like you'd read in the New Testament. No sort of blind eyes seeing anything. As a matter of fact, and then the other thing I noticed, so there's 3 points there. The third thing was I noticed that there was a lot of upset and disappointment and almost damage by people having so much hope in healing, and they go away not healed and actually get quite damaged by it. Yeah. So that was my experience in a nutshell, those 3 elements.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So that's the same sort of thing in our
Is that the same? Yeah.
Yeah.
You mean miracles not happening when people prayed, or anecdotes?
The kind of miracles are there in the background, and they would be, if something good happened, it would be attributed to God. And sometimes there was a bit of an unlikely incident aspect of it, as Christian puts it. But it wasn't in your face ever.
Right. And all the miracles that happened in your life, Francis?
Yes, non-stop miracles happening in my life. I suppose growing up as a kind of nominal Christian in our not very committed Church of England family, miracles were biblical stuff. Miracles happened in the Bible, but I didn't ever expect to see miracles in real life.
And at that point, did you think that they actually happened historically, those ones in the Bible?
Oh, yeah. When I was a kid, I mean, everybody I knew was Christian, so everybody said that, all the adults I knew always just talked about Christianity was true, this happened. So I was like, yeah, well, okay, that happened. Would never have occurred to me to question the adult understanding of the world.
Fair enough. Okay,
I'll read. I wish I'd brought my kids up like that.
We'll carry on reading now here. Right. Furthermore, I found a very interesting podcast from Robert L. White. I think it was Robert M. Price then, who deconstructed his faith, but has stuck the amount of has become stuck, I imagine, at the amount of well-documented Christian testimonies on miracles. Interesting. E.g. the books by Craig Keener and Lee Strobel. His point is that there is significant more healing in Christian context than anywhere else, and that this is evidence for at least a supernatural force. The Unbelievable podcast had an episode with Dr. Sean George, I remember that one, and who experienced a miracle himself too. Also, many Pentecostal churches claim miraculous healing, e.g. Bethel Church or Awakening Europe, even though some of them have proven as fake or are just not lasting. Of course, I could argue that unlikely incidents happen all the time, but the important point for me is that they all actually happened when they prayed for miracles. Okay, so it's the link between, say, the name of Jesus and something happens, I would imagine. I would almost call myself a post-evangelical or even agnostic, but all the miracles challenge my worldview again.
Yeah. So I find that quite surprising when I read that from Christian. Because I've never thought the miracle claims that I've sort of come across have been particularly strong arguments to point me towards Christianity. In fact, I was sort of finding it that the whole show around miracles is rather disconfirming. But we have now listened to the links and everything he's given, and I do now kind of see where he's coming from, and it'll be good to
unpack what could be happening in this sort of realm. I actually found miracles was the least of my problems in my faith deconstruction, because if they didn't happen, okay, something was I don't know, maybe you weren't praying enough or this or there's some other reason why it's not happening. But the fact is, it was very clear that it wasn't happening in any of the charismatic or even healing services. There was anything outstanding. So I just sort of put it and think, okay, so things don't happen like in the Bible. And that was in a charismatic church, not even in a non-charismatic church. So there was never an issue for me. I always thought there's a reasonable understanding for perceived miracles that would easily be persuasive to me. So it wasn't a hard one. Okay, so the final bit is, I would like to hear your thoughts on healing stories. Here in Germany, I cannot find any discussions that are close to yours and to those of American scholars like Peter-enns. I think that the discussion in German evangelicalism focuses more on lifestyle problems and less on apologetic topics. It's interesting. So please keep up your fantastic work. Best regards, Christian.
Thank you, Christian.
Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah,
excellent
thank you.
Now, Francis has listened to all of the links that Christian's given. In fact, we all have, but Francis is going to take charge here. So we are going to talk first about the individual stories and miracles that we came across in those links.
Go, Francis.
Yes.
Yep, starting with Lee Strobel.
That's right. Christian sent us a link to a video from Lee Strobel, and I believe this was for the launch of his book, The Case for Miracles. And he covers quite a lot of ground in this video, which we'll put a link in the show notes, will we, Ed?
Yeah, sure.
Will you be able to do that? Sure. So he goes through 3 miracles, and I'd like to deal with those three miracles in particular that he rehearses in his arguments. So the first one concerns a baby who was born in, I think, a village on the equator. And the baby was born very premature, and his mother died in childbirth. Now, apparently, it can get very cold at night on the equator, and they had this tiny baby who was very, very much premature, very fragile, and the baby was not going to survive the night because of it getting so cold on the equator. Who knew? Unless they could give it a hot water bottle. So somebody went to prepare a hot water bottle, and the hot water bottle burst, and it was the only hot water bottle in the village. So everybody, the story is apparently told to Lee Strobel by a missionary who was there at the village, and she asked all the village to pray. So everybody's praying for the baby, but there was a child called Ruth who specifically said, God, send a hot water bottle tonight, because tomorrow it's going to be no good. And Lee Strobel says, well, how was that prayer going to be granted? How was there going to be a delivery tonight, which included a hot water bottle? If you were sending anything to the equator, the last thing you would think they would need would be a hot water bottle. But anyway, then a delivery turns up, and it's got all the things you might expect. It's got medicine, stuff like that. But right at the bottom, they find a hot water bottle. And so how can you account for that? What an extraordinary thing. How can this possibly be anything other than a miracle? And Lee Strobel said that the missionary who told him the story said, I hadn't believed that I could really say amen to Ruth's prayer, because it just seemed so outlandish that you could ask God to send a hot water bottle. So I had a few issues with this story. First of all, it's from somebody who I don't doubt they're a truthful person, but we don't know. It was just, Lee Strobel does give her name, but the name doesn't mean anything to me. So we don't have any way of assessing how reliable she is as a witness, because people can be truthful witnesses, but not necessarily reliable witnesses. And like I say, although he mentions her name, is it that he got the story directly from her? It kind of implies that he did, but did he? We don't know that. So there are a few issues about that. And then the next issue I had was over the sort of circumstances of the story. I mean, why did the baby need specifically a hot water bottle? If there's a problem with it being cold in the equator, why couldn't somebody just hold the baby against their body all night? I mean, wouldn't that have done every bit as much as well as a hot water bottle? I just didn't understand that. I didn't understand why there couldn't be some alternative to keeping a baby warm than a hot water bottle. I have to say, a hot water bottle does not, to me, sound like a very safe way of keeping a baby warm. Not that I'm got any medical qualifications, but I would certainly be a bit worried about putting a baby next to a hot water bottle overnight. And the final thing that for me was odd about this was that Lee Strobel says, well, the parcel had actually been packed 5 months earlier. And it had come from a church that was connected with the mission, and the pastor at that church had felt moved by God to put in the hot water bottle. But the thing about that is, if the causal connection is supposed to be the prayer caused the hot water bottle to arrive, via God, then since the prayer didn't happen until 5 months after the hot water bottle had already been packed, what difference did the prayer make? Because what you're saying there is that the prayer, which was the cause, was after the effect. And that goes contrary to our whole understanding of cause and effect. In cause and effect, cause comes first, and then there's the effect.
Yeah.
So
that this cause and effect point, when I was a Christian, it would have just been water off a duck's back. I'd say, isn't God wonderful, and he knew. And
well, it gets all into theology of omniscience and ordination, doesn't it? Which is a whole nother.
But it was, I think that's right. But I think it also has an impact on free will, which most Christians do regard as quite important. Did the pastor who packed the hot water bottle, did he have free will to do that? If God had decided, if God had foreknowledge that there was going to be a prayer in 5 months' time, and he decided that he was going to grant it, did the pastor have foreknowledge?
Yeah, exactly.
Prayer and free will is a minefield.
It's absolutely minefield.
Why pray for your loved one to become a Christian if they've got free will?
Yeah, because they might. What's it going to do? You can't. Oh, God's going to override it for this prayer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris Date would say that God ordained the prayer to happen because he's just doing it that way. For example, as a Calvinist. So, yeah.
But the next story that Lee Strobel relates is about. Sorry, did you want to talk more about the?
So to me, this one is just a coincidence, massive coincidence. And Strobel says, "Look, do you want to make this a coincidence in your mind or a miracle?" But it is a coincidence. That's what it is. He is describing a coincidence.
He's describing a coincidence. And also, wouldn't it have been greater? My mind naturally goes, how about not doing a hot water bottle that's sent and packed in a package and gone through normal means and physical means? How about supernaturally keeping the baby? Or how about not even
how about the mum not dying in childbirth?
Exactly.
How about a hot water bottle just falling out of the sky?
Yeah, no, not even that. Just materializing like the TARDIS on Doctor Who. This would be something to say, and this water bottle, and then even then I'd say, well, why materialize hot water bottle? Why not supernaturally keep the baby? Why not stop the mother? And you just go back to all this stuff. God could apparently do all these things. So it all boils down to, it just so happens there's a hot water bottle, and how many hot water bottles might have been flying around packed anyway, statistically, I mean,
I suppose the Christian answer would be he granted the miracle to show so that you would know that he has these powers, so that you would
Yeah.
Yeah, and hence
so
hence the
his
greater
greatness would be manifest.
Yeah, hence the greater one of no mother dying, or just a miraculous appearance out of nowhere. A hot water bottle. You wouldn't even do that. Just keep it warm. You know.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, that's anyway, that's certainly what I thought. I mean,
this is the sort of typical thing that there are coincidences happen all the time because there are billions of people on the planet all having events all through the day.
Exactly.
And occasionally something's going to happen that's an astounding coincidence. It's just bound to it.
We'll get back to that later when I mention a quote from this book that I've got.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, great. Okay.
So you ready for me to go on with the next example?
Next one, please.
Yeah.
Which concerns somebody called Ben Carson, who became a brain surgeon and the youngest director of a department. Anyway.
And he's also, we know him because he was a candidate that Trump beat for the...
Oh, did he? I didn't know that.
Republican, yes, that's right.
Nomination. Oh, really? Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
A young Earth creationist, I believe.
Yes.
Didn't you say something silly about
surprise me?
Pyramids?
It would not surprise me.
Yeah. No, I think he's all in that category.
Anyway.
Yeah.
The story about Ben Carson is that he had to pass to get his doctor's qualification. He had to pass an exam in chemistry. He didn't like chemistry, wasn't good at chemistry, and realised that if he didn't pull something out of the bag, he was going to fail the paper. So he decided he would stay up all night and cram for his chemistry exam, but he fell asleep. And while he was asleep, he had a very strange dream. He dreamt that a sort of a shrouded figure he was in a room, in some kind of classroom. A shrouded figure was writing chemistry formulae on the board. And when he woke up, he went to the exam, and the first question was one of the formulas that this shrouded figure he'd seen in his dream writing on the board. And so was the next one, and so on. And he got through the exam, and he passed the exam, and then went on, as I say, to become a great doctor and a brain surgeon and the youngest ever director of something or other to do with the hospital, which is a huge achievement. And I'm not nobody's going to take that away from him. Huge achievement. So kudos to Ben Carson, but he puts it, at least in part, down to the fact that God sent him a dream to get him through his.
Hang around, Francis. Wouldn't that really cancel it out? Isn't that cheating? What about all the people who did the hard work without the help of the big friend? You know?
He did have to remember the formulae that were written on the board.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So I mean, this meets some of the objections that I made to the first example of the missionary, because it's a known person. On the face of it, you would think, well, we know something about this person. Obviously, he's got a brain the size of Belgium, so we can sort of have respect for his intellectual qualifications. But then it's got other big problems. I mean, a dream is inherently something that you can't have multiple attestation of. You can't have anyone back up your account. It's you who had the dream. It's you who's remembering the dream. It's you who's reporting what you've remembered. And as we all know, memory is a construct. And when it comes to looking at Ben Carson and how reliable he is as a witness, he has gone on record as saying that God has directly intervened 11 times in his life, miracles. And when you look at what he recounts as miracles, some of these are a bit iffy, I think. Might be. So one example of God intervening directly in Ben Carson's life, as recounted by Ben Carson, is that God helped him when he was on holiday to have an enjoyable African safari. He prayed to God, please let this, he'd always wanted to go on safari, and he prayed to God, please let this safari be everything I've hoped it would be. And then the next day, it was everything he hoped it would be. And he saw lots of animals. And the safari guide did say something like, oh, you've had a particularly good safari. You've seen all these wonderful animals. Because safari is a bit of a lottery. You may see the big three, or you may see, which I think are lions, elephants, and giraffes, I think. You may see more than that, or you may not see anything. It's a bit like whale watching. You may go out there, you may not be lucky. So his response to this was that God had granted him a miracle, that God had answered his prayers.
Unbelievable.
And the second example he gave, I thought was even worse than that. Apparently, he used to have an incompetent alcoholic secretary, and there was somebody, he needed to fire her. He knew that there was somebody who would be a much better secretary, and he really wanted to get this other secretary working for him. But he was dreading firing her because he felt sorry for her. Well, one day she just didn't come into work, and she disappeared. Nobody could find her. To this day, Ben Carson doesn't know what happened to that woman. And he was able to appoint the other woman as his secretary. So, I mean, this is God as a mafia boss. What happened to this poor woman? I mean, did God push her off a cliff or under a bus or something?
Yeah. How about helping her?
Well, quite. His primary reaction was not to think, "Oh, well, how awful!
How God can deliver you from alcohol."
But his Ben Carson's reaction was to think, God's granted me a miracle. He's disposed of this woman, to save me the awkwardness of having to fire her. Perhaps she's propping up a bridge or something in one of the pillars of the bridge. It just does sound like that. I just found that I found that extraordinary that he would count that as a miracle. Yeah. But anyway, so given that Ben Carson is clearly so willing to see miracles everywhere, how reliable is his memory of his dream and how it related to the questions in his exams? Because he says he'd been cramming. So if he was cramming, isn't it more likely that he dreamt, assuming he did have the dream as he described, that he dreamt about what he'd been cramming for already, or that he remembered what he'd been cramming, that when he was actually sitting in the exam room, he remembered the things he'd been cramming for, and he kind of reconstructed that into, that was what I dreamt about. Because you can never test how reliable your memory of a dream is, because it's only you are inevitably the only witness to a dream. So that was,
to me, a dream is your interpretation. Your memory of the dream isn't the dream. You just have this series of sort of mental images, and your brain connects them up. And if you connect them up in the remembering or in the middle of the night, I have no idea how you tell which it is.
Yeah, there's only one miracle that would be a real miracle about this one, Francis, and that would be, the miracle would be, if I believed this nonsense was true, that would be the real miracle. To get me to that stage, I just think this is nonsense. This doesn't even come anywhere near anything persuasive in any sense. I mean, there's so many holes, I think, in everything. Yeah. Like you said, the alcoholic, how about healing her and say, we've got a God that can heal you? Why seek to get rid of her? I mean, it's just like, I can't believe it myself, what I'm reading here or hearing here.
Yes. No, I mean, I was almost laughing out loud when I read that. And it just, from being on the surface quite a credible witness, to me, his credibility as a witness just evaporated.
Yeah. Anything could be a miracle. Anybody that's had a good holiday. It's no different than saying, I hope we have a good holiday on the safari. Doesn't rain and we see some animals. And you say, my gosh, we had a great holiday. And it's like, and other people have a disaster and the plane crashes with Christians on it. So, it's like, it's to me, maybe it's the way I'm wired, but I just can't see it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, Strobel does deal with a book that was written by Candy Gunther Brown on praying and whether it had any healing effects. So I don't know whether you want me to deal with that now briefly, or whether you want me to go on to the last miracle, which is the best. It's absolutely the best.
Oh, good. Well, I want to hear this.
What, the best of the bunch?
The best
miracle?
of the bunch. The defining one.
Okay.
Because he says that this isn't just him kind of gathering up a few thoughts before doing a talk the next morning. He said he spent 2 years trawling, looking for miracle stories to put in his book. So of all the amazing things that's been happening, he should be picking up quite a few of them with his two years of research. And if this is the best we've got, we're call me unimpressed. But this next one is impressive.
It is impressive. Yes, yeah. Yes, this is Barbara Snyder. Barbara was, as a teenager, she started to have issues, and they were eventually diagnosed as multiple sclerosis. And when she was, I think she was, by the time she was 34, she had deteriorated to the point where she was bedridden. She couldn't see, she couldn't walk. She was in a hospice scheme. I mean, my understanding from having read the notes and read the doctor's accounts was that she wasn't at the hospice. She was at home, but getting hospice care. But she was, she couldn't breathe. She had to have a tracheotomy. And she hadn't been able to walk for 2 years. But they were not expecting her to last more than 6 months. Her doctor said the prognosis is so poor that the next time she has a crisis, we're not going to hospitalise her. She should just we'd just be deferring the inevitable. So she was expected to die in fairly short term. But the only thing they could ask for was prayers. They wrote to a local Christian radio station and asked people to pray for her. And I think I haven't written it down in my notes, but Lee Strobel, I think, says they know that there were at least 450 prayers, because people wrote in to say we've been praying for her.
But people have been praying for her for decades already.
I don't know if they've been praying for her in those numbers. And that might be something we
it
want
was like
to pull
a special
apart.
Deal, I guess. But
pull apart later. That can numbers sway God's mind? But anyway, there were an awful lot of people praying for her. Apparently, in this sort of leading up to this day, which was a Sunday. It was the Sunday of Pentecost, and I understand that it was also her sister's birthday, and her aunt went round with a massive bag of letters from Christians who'd written in to the radio station to say we were praying for you, and was reading these letters out to her, I understand. And then she was, so Barbara was in her bedroom, and she had two friends there. I think the aunt had gone by this point, but this is one of these things where the details get a little bit confusing as you read the different accounts from either Barbara or from her doctor. But anyway, she was there with two friends, and she heard a male voice behind her say, "My child, get up and walk." And she says that she knew that this must be the voice of God. And she told her two friends, "Go and call my family." So they ran out, or possibly they didn't. Again, this not quite clear from the various accounts. Called the family, and her mother and father came up, and Barbara is described as having leapt out of bed, and she hadn't been able to walk for 2 years. Now, this is something that Lee Strobel, I think, gets wrong, and that the other podcast, the Andrew L. White podcast, I believe, also gets wrong. They both say 7 years.
You're talking about me?
But, no, it is. Did I get that wrong? Anyway, it's
Andrew L. White.
It's the podcast that Christian mentioned.
Robert.
Robert.
Apologies.
You're talking, you're mixing us.
Oh. Yes, I am. I'm really sorry. Robert L. White.
I'm on this podcast, by the way.
Yes. we may do a swap. We may do a podcast host swap. That'd be interesting. He says 7 years. So it does, but the doctor's notes, I'm sure, say 2 years, but we'll get to that later. But anyway, 2 years, 7 years. She hadn't walked for a long time and muscles atrophy. So it's extraordinary that she could stand up, let alone walk. And she could see. So, and that evening she walked down the aisle of her local church. And there is attestation to this. There is Barbara herself, who remains completely free of multiple sclerosis and married a pastor and, has, I think, run some kind of church-related site at which she tells her story. There is an account which was written by Barbara's doctor at the time, and there is also you will be able to find on various miracle sites which recount this miracle a copy of her notes. So there's this that is quite extraordinary. But one of the things I found about this was something that I found with most other very extraordinary miracle claims, which is that you kind of, although there is attestation from various people, you do end up hitting a brick wall where it never goes, you can never get beyond. I was Googling this, and I was hoping to find other doctors commenting on it, perhaps. I was hoping to find regular newspaper comments on it. I was hoping to find accounts from her parents. I was hoping to find witness accounts from the two friends who'd been in the room with her. And I just couldn't get that. The most detailed account I could get was her doctor, and his Dr. Thompson. He is quoted in a book to which we can provide a link in the show notes, called Searching Deeper, Searching for Miracles, that which was itself written. That's a collation of stories which was compiled itself by a doctor, and apparently the chapter on Barbara is given in the words of her own doctor, Dr. Thompson. And you will also find there a photocopy of her notes. But the notes are very short. They don't go, you don't read the whole of her notes. It's just a relatively brief account of, well, this happened, and she's now completely cured. But you don't go back, you don't see anything of the previous notes and what was going on when she was being treated, which, I don't know, and perhaps there were issues about privacy. That's understandable, but it also makes it quite hard to put this, just this end part about, okay, she's cured now, and this happened after she'd been prayed for, and her doctors think it's the hand of God. And I really struggled with the timeline, looking at the notes and looking at the account given by Dr. Thompson. The photocopy of the report seems to say she was given a tracheotomy on the 14th of May 1982, but the miracle is supposed to have happened on the 7th of June 1981, and the report seems to be dated 1981. So is it a typo?
Well, we could get an apologist in to harmonise different accounts. It can easily be done, Francis. Come on.
I'm not thinking wide enough, am I?
You're not thinking like an apologist, I'm afraid.
But even if it should read 1981 and that is just a typo, the date given in Dr. Thompson's account for the tracheotomy is 1980. And this was after he agreed, apparently, there should be no further hospitalisation. So how does that fit? No hospitalisation, but she's taken in for a tracheotomy or something similar. And apparently that's just 2 weeks before there's a miracle cure. So I just found it quite confusing. There was one newspaper report from the, what's it called? The Rock Island Argos. But no follow-up from any other more, from any national newspaper, let alone an international newspaper. And you do sort of worry, well, why was that not more newsworthy? And I couldn't read the Argos account. I could see that it had a headline, that it was obviously about her, that the headline was, "She heard, get up my child and walk, miracle cure." But then you can't read any of the details. So, again, it would have been a valuable piece of close to contemporaneous reporting of what was said at the time. And it was frustrating that I just couldn't access it. I mean, I suppose that was one of the things I just found impossible. Oh, sorry, her doctor's name was Thomas Marshall. I don't know why I've been saying it's Thomas Marshall is the name of the doctor.
It would be good to get other doctors who knew him and around him, whether they all shared his way of putting it as well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They may say, oh, he's a bit like that. You know what I mean? So you just don't know. You just want to research, don't you, to do it?
He is clearly a very dedicated Christian, because in his account he says something like, at one point she almost lost faith in God, but then she came to see how God was, how she should accept the hand of God in her life, and just accept that God had decided to do whatever he was decided. I mean, he writes something that he is very, very clearly a committed Christian. Well, that's not, one shouldn't dismiss what he says. He's still a doctor. He's still a qualified doctor. He's still someone that prima facie you should accept as when that if he says her condition was hopeless and that then he saw her and she was cured, there's no reason to doubt that. But yes, it would have been good to get other medical reports and to have seen more of the medical background, and also to have got more of more attestations from other witnesses, given that there are, I don't want to be too picky. I don't want to be, the obdurate atheist that nothing you're going to say is ever going to convince me. But there are these little details, like, she says her friends ran out. Barbara says her friends ran out of the room. I haven't got the Dr. Marshall's report open in front of me, but he I believe says that they saw her jump out of bed, whereas she says she told them to run out the room before she jumped out of bed. So it's it's
just like the Gospels again, I'm afraid. And it's like gosh,
that the a complete turnaround from multiple sclerosis it isn't that unusual. What sounds amazing here is how immediate, according to the story, it occurred.
I think a complete turnaround from MS is unusual, but it's not unprecedented. I found a couple of non-miracle connected instances that were on the net, and will you be able to put the links in the show notes, Ed?
The share care one.
Yes, that's one, I believe, from a blog written by a doctor who says that one of the most incredible turnarounds that he personally observed was a patient who was unable to talk, walk, or use her arms or legs at all. She was blind, had severely slurred speech, and could not swallow or even stay awake. She was unable to care for herself at home. She was hospitalised. She didn't respond to standard treatment. Her prognosis was very gloomy, and they assumed she would never recover. But he says she made a slow improvement. So again, that's a difference. It wasn't like instantaneous while she was in hospital, and eventually returned completely to normal. He says her recovery was not due to treatment, but apparently due to some body defense system. And for the next 12 years, her MS continued on a mild relapsing remitting course. Well, so it wasn't the complete cure that Barbara Snyder had, but it does indicate that the body is an incredible thing, and we don't know all about it. And it does have powers that, without having recourse to miracles, doctors can't always explain. The other story I found was somebody who does have MS themselves and writes a blog, and they say not long after their own diagnosis, they met through doing work in a charity shop another volunteer who had the disease and was worse than he was. She described her disease as being responsible for her being blind in one eye, nearly blind in the other. She had to use braces to walk, and even then it was extremely difficult. She always had pain, and she had numbness in both of her feet and hadn't been able to feel anything in either foot for 14 years. And then she came into the shop where they both volunteered one day and said that she, when she woke up that morning, she felt different. And she couldn't really explain how she was different. And then it's quite interesting that the words used by the writer of this blog is, after that description, little did either of us realise the miracle that was about to take place. 2 weeks after our conversation, she was in complete remission. Her eyesight in both eyes had returned to 20/20. She had full feeling in both of her feet and no longer needed her braces because she could walk just fine without them. So the blog writer asked his neurologist about this, and the neurologist said, yes, spontaneous remission is possible, but it's very rare, so I wouldn't get my hopes up too much. So, you know, that's...
Yeah. So this is...
There you are.
This is the most impressive story that was in all the material that Christian told us about, or led us towards.
Or... Yes, that's right. Out of the various links he gave, this story cropped up in a couple of them, and you know, fair enough. It's very striking. I mean, I'm not going to just wave it aside as, you know, phooey. You know, that's no big news. This does call. It's quite challenging. It is quite challenging, I think.
So I think if. You know, I'm not going to let go of my naturalism hearing the story. So I'm going to tell myself a story as to how we might have got this information being told to us without anything unnatural taking place. Is that fair?
Yeah, go on then.
That's a way of putting it. So I would feel that, you know, it looks like this remarkable spontaneous remission did occur, as can do. And perhaps some of the details of the story are impacted by our poor memories. It's not that we don't remember things; it's that we kind of change our memories, and the way we link events and the stories we tell ourselves does alter memory. So that in the telling and the remembering and the re-remembering, things do become more dramatic.
That is precisely why I would have liked to have seen accounts from all the other witnesses. You know, the pastor at her church, like I say, the two girlfriends, her parents, her sister, and it was just frustrating that everywhere I looked, I couldn't find any sites that dealt with it pretty much other than Christian sites, and they all repeated the same story, and they all had the same links to the same accounts, you know, either be to Lee Strobel or it would be to this account given by Dr. Marshall, or it would be to Barbara Snyder herself talking on YouTube to Lee Strobel. and you just could never dig any deeper. You just hit solid rock at that point, and that was all the information you were ever
There's been
get.
lots of stories like this that I've heard over the years that have been researched, and someone has gone and done the journalistic thing and actually found, I think there was somebody on the BBC, in fact, some particular program looked into miracles, particularly I think it was at Benny-hinn. Benny-hinn is sort of well known for this sort of miracle healing. Now, not Benny Hill from the O's in English from years ago, Benny-hinn, and this program they actually went to search for all these miracle people who got out of wheelchairs and things like that. And when they researched it back, none of it actually happened. And even if it did, there was sort of interesting stories about, they went back in the wheelchair the next day, that sort of thing, which wasn't promoted around the church, if you know what I mean. And so all of this stuff is like, it's like, in one sense, it's like, okay, give us one great one, but then isn't it soured and tainted by all of these other stories that turn out to be like that, and what would Christians respond if this exact thing happened in Islam? Yeah. We prayed to Allah and it was wonderful. And do you go, so my gosh, we're in the wrong faith? Or do you go, it's a demon, or it's amazing what Christians might say to this story outside of Christian faith, in another faith, Hinduism or something,
Yeah.
So I would have questions like that.
Yeah. Well, shall we carry on? Christian mentioned Dr. Sean George, who was on Unbelievable last April. And that was it was fairly impressive at the time, but I'll tell the story, shall I?
Yes,
because most of our listeners probably would have already listened to all this. He was the person in Australia he was 39 at the time and had a heart attack driving along and had to end up in a local, feels like a GP surgery sort of setting, in a small town on his journey. And he had a cardiac arrest fairly soon after, kind of admitting himself to this place. And they did CPR repeatedly over an hour and about 20 minutes. And eventually his wife came and she prayed for him after they'd given up on the CPR, about 5 to 10 minutes after they'd given up. And he revived pretty well then and there. And the doctors at the time were absolutely thought, oh no, this is not good news when his heart restarted, because they thought that he'd be brain damaged for life. But as it turned out, he was completely recovered. He recovered absolutely completely with his brain function and everything. And this was the center of a kind of test case for a conference in the northwest of America, somewhere in rural Washington state, where they had sessions of debates and that sort of thing on miracles. And this was like the showcase one. And Justin-Brierly was the host of the discussion. And they had a couple of guests who were not medically trained. They were more philosophers. One was a Christian, but felt he seemed fairly kind of skeptical and questioning. And the other was an atheist who was particularly skeptical and questioning. It sort of felt at the time, listening to the Unbelievable show, that it was quite impressive. But what actually was the case, what I felt anyway, was that all of the medical knowledge, the gatekeeper of the medical knowledge, was the person claiming the miracle. Because, of course, Dr. George himself was a very well-trained and knowledgeable medic himself. So everyone was deferring to his medical knowledge in terms of how miraculous this really was. Now, the philosopher who wasn't a Christian did a response PDF kind of in preparation for his participation in the event. And Justin actually linked it in the show notes of the Unbelievable episode. And it really is quite strong stuff, linking to these medical reports, that was in the Lancet and that kind of thing. And when this chap Bradley Bowen was talking to Dr. George sort of dismissed it and just talked about other stuff. He didn't really pick up at all on the information that Bradley Bowen was presenting in his research he'd done on the medical, and it seemed really powerful stuff. What you had a look at it, Francis? What did you think?
Yeah, I was because I was really, again, I was very challenged in my skepticism by Sean George's account of what happened. And then when I read the link that you provided to the statistics on people who can recover and how the continuation of CPR can have an effect so that the brain doesn't die. I was sort of like, oh wow! So it turns out this miracle, which just sounded so impressive, was maybe not so impressive after all. It was maybe just a reflection of pretty ordinary, known medical science. Although apparently it's quite recent that they've started taking this approach. That, I mean, I don't know whether you want to explain. Perhaps I'm assuming access to what I've seen that the listeners won't have had. So I don't know. Do you want to explain?
Well, what was supposed to be amazing was that the CPR carried on so long, and they'd given up, and then there was he revived. Dr. George revived, and it was at the end of the of the kind of what can happen. But some people have, I think, even more than 2 hours occasionally that CPR is attempted. And so there is still hope, even after 2 hours, that it can work. But it's incredibly rare. And he was administered oxygen, which I think surely makes a difference. That so even little bits of blood going around with the CPR is picking up oxygen from the lungs and being delivered to the brain to prevent the brain.
Because the supposed miracle was that he should have been brain dead. That was what he was saying. And then there's been this research that says that if people can come back, and what's really key is continuing the CPR, and that it appears to be what they did. That they didn't just stop CPR after 20 or 30 minutes. They kept going. They kept going for 70 minutes, I think he says, and that therefore he wouldn't have been in the situation where he was necessarily brain dead. And although it's not it's not necessarily common that people can come back after this time, it's also not rare. And of those that do come back, they will generally come back with a good degree of brain function. Some of them will not be adversely affected at all, or some may be slightly affected but have enough brain function to have to live an independent life and only have a minor effect on their brain functioning. But the two things that were supposed to be so extraordinary, that he could come back at all and that he came back with his full brain function, are apparently not necessarily that striking. They're not necessarily usual, but they're by no means unprecedented or inexplicable.
Yeah. And what's so striking, I guess, is that there wasn't someone who was absolutely on top of the science who was there to dispute his interpretation of these events.
Yes, we're talking about the Unbelievable podcast, where the person who was responding was not medically trained.
Yes, that's right. So he'd done a bit of reading and he presented this information, and Dr. George sort of didn't say. He just said, "Well, I'm not sure I've heard of that, but here's something I have heard about." And then he talked about what he had heard about. So he was sort of being the gatekeeper of the discussion on when it came to the science. so you couldn't really tell if he was so kind of such an evangelist for his miracle that he wanted to make sure that any science that was putting questions on it was sort of kept away from the discussion. He just didn't know. I mean, he could have been completely honest. Surely he would have heard of this Lancet paper because it's so relevant, and yet he didn't sort of seem to either know about it or he certainly didn't pick up on it when it was mentioned.
Well, I mean, he sounded to me to be a perfectly decent person, so I'm sure he wasn't being dishonest. But yes, he could be swayed by his commitment to his own story, because to him, his life was a miracle. So,
yes,
I
think
and
we're doing that on this episode. We have our worldview, and we're
absolutely,
yeah.
I mean, I think that was one of the points that. Well, I don't want to start introducing too many other podcasts, but the Hinge podcast that we all liked did an episode on miracles, and both of them said on that, all stories you hear, you will always interpret through your pre-existing worldview. So we're doing that, and Christians are doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are other observations as well. Has any of you taken into account the problem with a miracle like this, even if it does happen? Because I tend to sort of think laterally about things like this, and that's if you see it linked with other things. Because if you're talking about a miracle as this is meant to be demonstrating God, like we've got our listener, Christian, who's saying this is the thing that makes me sort of hold on to sort of this is God. If you link it to something I'm just about to say now, it actually changes everything as far as I'm concerned. I have known at least personally 10 to 15 in Christian circles who have had cancer, who are big things where there's massive prayer meetings, where there's people have all night prayer meetings for healing, words from God saying he will be healed, and they just die like everybody else who's not being prayed for. I've got testimony there. Now, if this does happen, to me that's really upsetting. It's like, then you have a whole problem of why God does one thing. Okay, so say this was Jesus and was God. I've got 15 friends who died with such and damaged a lot of people who prayed so hard for their healing, and it didn't happen. So if you link it all together, how much testimony is this to pull you to God? If anything, you could believe, you don't disregard God, but you'd be very angry because he could have healed all of them with such fervent prayer, But this guy comes out like this. How many people in a non-Christian setting could we find some stories that are just like this guy but have nothing to do with Jesus? Then I would say, well, all the ones to do with Jesus that I know that didn't work, well, that's a thumbs down for God as far as I can see. And then this one that it's nothing to do with God, it happens. To me, we're in a universe where this happens. Yeah. Incredible. What looks like a miracle against loads of them that don't happen when they pray.
Yeah. Can I read my thing from the Christian Premier magazine article by Rob Parsons?
Oh yes, I've seen that.
Because that's exactly what you're saying. I've experienced this as well. People in our church a young man who died of cancer, had stuff in his teeth, and it was just horrible. And everyone praying, and it just happens again and again.
Yep.
Anyway, so this is Rob Parsons, who is sort of like the James Dobson of the UK scene, maybe not quite so conservative, but he is a very well-respected Christian leader, who particularly one of his things is to talk about the kind of ethical side and family values and everything. But he is here doing a kind of quick one-page article for the Premier magazine, a Christian magazine, and he says the title is "Sorry to be awkward, but we need to talk about healing." And in the article, he talks about just this very event that someone in the church gets ill, cancer, and it's looking bad, and so this is what he writes about it. The next step is often that a small group of people agree to meet regularly to pray for the person to be healed. I thank God for those who are prepared to do that, but here's my dilemma. The weekly meetings continue, and then one day somebody within the local church, or perhaps even from outside it, declares that God has revealed to them that the person will be healed. Perhaps even they are already healed. It's not hard to see why some of the prayers, and of course the person themselves, will grasp that declaration with both hands. The crucial point here is that these declarations, whether made within the local church or outside it, are unequivocal. This person will be well. And then the person dies.
Yeah.
The next steps are predictable, and you can imagine what they might be. And he finishes about how there's no accountability for this, and he says, I have known churches repeat this cycle time and time again. So this is a Christian leader kind of almost spilling the beans on this within a Christian publication, and he's so concerned about it that there is all this expectation around prayer and healing, and the absolute typical normal situation is that nothing happens. What I'd like to do is give about 6 points of the whole scene of miracles. I'll try and kind of rattle through them so that what we've heard is in context. So the first one is that before we actually look at any evidence, we would expect there to be a lot of healings in Christianity if we read the New Testament. Obviously, Jesus healed everyone who came to him. There's lots of promises about how followers of Jesus will do even greater miracles than Jesus did. There's promises that if you get sick, the elders of the church will pray for you. It's all over the place. So you would expect there to be a lot of healing miracles in the church. So that was sort of point one. Point two is that actually they don't happen, as Andrew and my Rob Parsons man have described. And then prayer for healing happens all the time. There's an estimate that there's about 500 million Pentecostal charismatic Christians in the world, and whenever anyone's sick, that's what they do. They pray. So there's just billions of prayers going up all the time for healings, and there's not very much to show for it. If we're counting the hits and the misses, well, the misses are just overwhelming. I have to say, actually, I can't resist not telling the story. In the 90s, we were down in Cornwall, and we noticed there was Trevor Deering, who was a well-known healer, healing ministry man, was at a local church in this Cornish village. We thought, we'll go along and sort of see what's going on. And so we turn up, and rather sheepishly at the door, someone said, I'm terribly sorry. Brother Trevor is a bit ill, and he can't come, and the meeting's cancelled. So that's the typical thing.
Yes.
Then there's the whole set of observations we have around healing rallies and the kind of thing that we know can be done without supernatural help. And enormous on this is Darren Brown. He's a big figure in discussion of miracles, in my view. And there was a fantastic couple of episodes on The Unbelievable Show, which of course we'll link to, where they talk to Darren Brown and they go to his, he called it Miracle, his show that was on at the time, and they had a sort of discussion, some leading people in the Premier group discussing it on The Unbelievable Show, and I thought it was brilliant. Do you either you two remember that one?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and
I'm not sure about that one actually.
Andrew, you missed a treat.
Yeah, I must have.
No, yeah. I think he's great. I love Darren Brown.
Hang on. Well, he's been on several times, though, hasn't he? I saw his program.
Yes, it was a double header.
Yeah,
I think he talked about sort of generally about the resurrection and that sort of thing, and his experience.
Was that also about the homosexual thing as well, in terms of healing?
Yes, that's right,
and all of that business, and he kind of respected that. Yeah, if that's the one, yes, I did see that. Then hear that.
Yeah, I think there was the second one was more on miracles.
On miracles in that sense.
Yeah,
yeah. So it's
so he could do amazing things just through the the kind of expectation, release of adrenaline in the show.
Yeah,
and it really kind of knocked some of these Christians that
totally,
the kind of stuff they were used to attributing to God in church or in healing meetings.
Yeah, and so you mean also the TV show that he did where he did masquerade as an evangelist as well? Yeah, that's right. And you just saw the willingness in believers to take it all on board, and then he told them, and they completely fell for it. Yeah, that's right. And that just shows you in a sense, the willingness to believe is really coming first before the reality of what could be the reality, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
clouding it. So
yeah. I mean, if he chose to be a spoof healer, what are they called? You know, people. He could be an Indian guru sort of chap, and people would absolutely flock following him, and he could make enormous amounts of money.
Absolutely do that, because you're this.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting. This might be a point to mention the book that I've just got. John Loftus' book?
Yes. I think we're running out of time. So what I could do is we could kind of reconvene next month and carry on. Have a Summer of Miracles again.
Yes, I think so. Okay, well, we'll sort of just talk about this little book then, yeah, and the article from it, and that will sort of prompt us to that. Oh, there is another point as well. There's another book, Bart-Ehrman's book, The Triumph of Christianity. I don't know if you two knew this, but the big emphasis on his book on why Christianity grew was really fascinating, at least from Constantine onwards. And ever guess what it was?
Why it grew?
Yeah.
I thought they were brilliant in plagues and things, being heroic and kind to people.
No. Well, that may have been some of the 2nd century early stuff, but from Constantine onwards, it was two things. It was a two-pronged thing, and Bart-Ehrman was saying in his book, outlining sort of the evidence for it, that it was actually the teaching on hell. That's a given, sort of like the threat of this is what will happen to you, particularly the traditional view of eternal torment, and miracle stories. And he goes into all this stuff about miracle stories that they were being passed around and pushed on, and it was so enlightening and enlivening people. It was producing faith. And of course, a lot of it, he was saying, isn't actually something that they're testifying to seeing. It's the passing on of the story. So not only have you got it in the Bible, Jesus feeds the 5,000, but you've got these other miracle stories. I think Augustine mentioned some of these, and or Augustine, some people say. And that was really interesting to me to see this two-pronged, what produced a lot of faith and growth. He said, did you know over there, they healed the so-and-so? And it was the story that did it. They didn't necessarily have of of saying, well, let's trace that story with skepticism. They just believed it. And it produced a faith. Do you think that's interesting? From a psychological point of view?
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, that's right. So that was part of that. This other book is called The Case Against Miracles. And in one sense, the whole thing that we were doing this show, sort of brought about by our friend Christian, is in fact, one reviewer of this book called The Case Against Miracles is not directly against Lee Strobel, I don't think, but somebody said this is kind of the opposite to Craig Keener and Lee Strobel, which is really interesting. And I've just read a couple of chapters. I just thought I would read the opening because it ties into a lot of what we said today in terms of the coincidence miracle. And just a few paragraphs here. And it's got on the miracle. This was Michael Shermer's forward to it. And so it's called The Case Against Miracles. Okay. Have you ever gone to the phone to call a friend only to have the phone ring first and find your friend on the line? What are the odds of that? Not high, to be sure, but the sum of all probabilities equals 1. How many times did you phone your friend and he or she didn't call? How many times did your friend phone and you weren't thinking of him or her? Multiply that by a couple of 100 million in the US alone, making dozens of calls a day, and it becomes almost inevitable that this seemingly miraculous connection, which many people attribute to the synchronicity or karma or supernatural force of God or whatever, is fully explained by probabilities. Give enough opportunities, anomalies, even apparent miracles will happen. And thanks to the confirmation bias in which we look for and find confirming evidence for what we already believe and ignore and rationalize away disconfirming evidence, we will remember the hits and forget the misses. And that's not the person you're married to if you're a guy. But the missus.
Oh dear.
Yeah, oh dear. Sorry. Yes.
Oh, please.
You know that's my humour. Come on. Right. What have you two got to say about that? Well, we've said it really, but you know.
Yeah. No,
Yes.
I mean, you know, he puts it very well, as one might expect. Yes.
Yeah.
Coincidences do happen, and all of us, inevitably, in the scheme of things, will come up against or be confronted with some extraordinary coincidences.
Exactly. So how many times? So the missed opportunities that you haven't picked up on, you just dismiss. The one that hits, you rave about. And but how about giving just as much attention to every one of those misses? You know, and that's not done. So that was a really interesting opener for that book.
Yeah, and they are so painful. All these misses, all these people dying of cancer with young children or children themselves. Suffering.
Exactly. And then it gets all more complicated because people bring the devil into it when it goes wrong. And so suddenly the devil, you know, I had a friend told me that you didn't get these when they really happen. Miracles really happen. I said, why wouldn't it get onto GMTV or these news thing right across the top pages there? Well, the devil wants to stop the true stories coming out. And I'm thinking, what? Now you've got the devil stopping the healing news getting out. It's like, it's a different world. It's a different worldview. Yeah. Anyway.
Anyway, I've got some more up my sleeve, and you want to talk about miracles in the New Testament, Andrew, as well, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mean like now?
No.
Next
time,
the next episode. I'm going to say. So we will talk about the different ways that the Gospels look at miracles, which is interesting, and then you've got a whole lot more up your sleeve, Ed.
Yeah.
On this, so you know, well, the fact that we've got to episode 30 is a miracle. So there you go.
Yes.
So we're right on the ball with miracles. There's someone try and deconstruct that, you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we do read and think about the feedback we are given. So, Christian, again, thank you very much. And do other people do write in and to the doubts aloud at gmail.com email address.
Yeah,
we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, and it's great to it really is good, isn't it, to hear back from someone that would say, particularly when they avidly sort of wait for the next one to pop up on iTunes or other platforms. It's just really nice to know that because we feel like in one sense we're having conversation just between us three, and then there's a sort of a listening group out there, this mysterious group. So to hear from somebody is wonderful, actually. So you know, it's nice to hear from the different people that we've heard from. So keep it going, keep it up.
Yeah. Yes, we do appreciate it.
Okay, so the next time we will be carrying on with miracles. So and it'll be another miraculous show. So I've been Andrew, your host.
I've been Francis.
And I'm Ed. And thank you.
Until next time, goodbye.